Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at Central European University. My name is Peter Balázs. I'm a professor of the school and the director of the Center for EU Neighborhood Studies, which is one of the research centers of CEU. Today we have the utmost pleasure to welcome a special guest speaker in the person of Cas Mudde, who will deliver the keynote speech of this conference about liberal democracy's responses to the populist challenge. We have been dealing several times with this famous populist challenge, the various phenomena of that political drive. This time, our guest speaker is taking the other end of the issue, the reactions, the responses. And I can only hope that he would enlarge the scope and not only the responses, but prevention, protection, and other aspects of populism. Today it's difficult to say anything new in the age of internet because anybody can test the qualities and the CV of Cas Mudde. But let me just recall that he was born in the Netherlands. Later on he moved to the United States. He visited several universities and he delivered lectures at several universities, among others in his very early years, Central European University, back in the last century. Today he is attached to the University of Antwerp in Belgium, and he has a long list of challenging publications about the far-right investor democracies, Islamophobia, Israeli settler movement, populism around the world, and many other interesting issues. Before giving the floor to the keynote speaker, let me express our gratitude to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for having supported this event, as several others, and the two co-organizers, Political Capital and Policy Solutions. And at that moment, I would like to ask Tamás Boros to address the conference in the name of the co-organizers. So, Tamás, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tamás Boros, the co-director of Policy Solutions think tank, and I would like to thank you for coming on behalf of all organizations. And I think if we had organized the very same conference 1 year ago, like last summer, it is highly possible that our guests from Western Europe would have been as pessimistic and as depressed as the Hungarian guests, which is a big word because the Hungarians are world champions in depression and pessimism. But if you remember just 1 year ago, it was when Brexiters won the election, when the referendum in the UK. It was only 1 year ago when many analysts said that Marine Le Pen could win the presidential elections in France. It was only 1 year ago when a lot of analysts said that Geert Wilders' party could win the election in the Netherlands. They were leading the opinion polls. It was only 1 year ago when the Austrian people's confidence was shaken in their democratic institutions, and they were expecting that Norbert Hofer from the Freedom Party would win the rerun of the presidential elections, and thus he could become the very first right-wing, far-right president in Western Europe since the Second World War. Also, only 1 year ago, the popularity of both Angela Merkel's CDU and the SPD dropped to new lows. And 1 year ago, the German press was full with the successes of the right-wing populist AfD. And 1 year ago, out of the 28 EU member states, in 26 EU members, there was at least one populist parties in their respective parliaments. And then out of the 28 member states, there were populist parties in the government in 9 EU member states, either as major governing party or as coalition partners. However, 1 year has passed, and the populist breakthrough didn't happen in Western Europe. In fact, it seems that 2017 will be the year of the liberal democracy in Western Europe. Van der Bellen won the presidential elections in Austria. The People's Party for Freedom and Democracy won the parliamentary election in the Netherlands. Actually, no one fears anymore that the EFD or the UKIP can be a serious contender of the mainstream parties. Actually, both parties lost more than 5 percentage points just within a few months' time. In Finland, the Finns has lost half of their voting base since they are in government, and Marine Le Pen's party, the Front National, is expected to have some 10 to 20 seats in the French National Assembly. Meanwhile, Macron's movement could have as much as 300 or 400. We saw the numbers, we've seen the numbers, and in all Western European countries, without exception, the popularity of the populist party has decreased during the last 12 months. Of course, it doesn't mean that we should underestimate the populist surge. They are much stronger than, for example, 5 years ago. Their message have been taken or copied by other parties. They totally transformed the political landscape in many countries. They contributed to the collapse of some mainstream parties, see France, for example. And in many countries, the old quasi-two-party system has become at least three-party system wherein the left are not only competing against the conservatives, but with the populists as well. So this competition is by no means over, and the three political sides currently have more or less equal support in Europe, naturally with varying trends and possibilities from country to country. But in most Western European countries, the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the Greens are still the defenders of the system and the liberal democracy. So currently in Western Europe, only a minority of the voters supports anti-system parties. I usually say that in Western Europe, liberal democracy has two-thirds majority. However, the situation is very different in Eastern Europe. Within the whole European Union, this region is the most affected one by populism. 67% of the Hungarians, 51% of the Polish, 47% of the Czechs, and 40% of the Slovakian likely voters would vote for the populist parties. In the whole European Union, the country where the level of support for populist parties has increased the most last year, it was in Slovakia. With less than a year, the number of those citizens who favors a populist party has increased by 26 percentage points just within a year. So in these countries, in these Eastern European countries, now the majority or close to the majority of the voters actually prefer populists to mainstream parties. Apparently, populism in that regard is a bit similar to other international trends, namely what is going out of fashion in the West is still flourishing in the East. So in this conference, in the next 2 hours, we would like to speak about these questions and these problems and how liberal democracy can tackle populism, also in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, where I think the problem is more accurate. And we asked several questions. Maybe you saw it in the program, like how should parties create credible and attractive political alternatives without adopting populist rhetoric? How could parties reframe the debates about difficult topics, which we see nowadays in the news, like identity, culture, migration, and how they can do it in order to weaken increasing nationalistic, xenophobic, and authoritarian tendencies? And how can we strengthen arguments in favor of pluralism and democratic values against growing social demand for illiberal and authoritarian politics? These are the questions which we would like to find some answers, and it is a very, very great honor that we have the most well-known expert on populism, Cas Mudde, with us. who will, as it was mentioned, deliver the keynote speech of this conference. But after Mr. Mudde's keynote speech, panelists will discuss these topics together with Professor Mudde. It is a pleasure that Cristina Arato, Associate Professor and the Deputy Director of the Institute of Political Science in ELTE AEK, will be with us, and also András Bozóki, who is professor here at the Central European University. This discussion will be chaired by Jan Niklas Engels. He is the head office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Budapest. After this panel, you will have the opportunity for questions and answers. And at the end of the conference, it will be again Mr. Péter Balázs, the director of the CEU Center for European Neighborhood Studies, who will conclude this conference. So I hope that the whole conference will be very successful and useful for us, and also for you, of course. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Mudde. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm actually not used to coming up with solutions and being the optimistic voice in the room. And let's not forget that I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands we're very good at criticizing and complaining. But our Calvinism generally keeps us a little bit from seeing the happy future. Of course, everything is about a bar. Like, whether things are going well or not depends, to a certain extent, what you expect. And the bar that was just set was the bar of Western Europe, which is an understandable bar for Central and Eastern Europe. But I'm not totally convinced that Western Europe is looking as good. I'm also not totally convinced that Central and Eastern Europe looks that bad. But you can take another bar, which is one of the few that we still have left, to look reasonably lightly at Hungary. Last week I was in Istanbul, and things go worse there. So at least you have them. So we've done quite a lot of work about what populism is. And of course we still disagree, because that's what academics do, but increasingly people see it as a set of ideas that speak about society as consisting of two different groups that are homogeneous and antagonistic, the pure people and the corrupt elite. And then there's debate about whether this is just a rhetorical trick to get to power, or whether populist politicians actually believe in that. And I believe that it's more than just a strategy. I believe that populism is an ideology, and it's because of the populist ideology that certain attacks on liberal democracy are made. What I will focus on now is discuss very shortly the reasons for the success of populism, which isn't that straightforward. But obviously, if we don't know why populism is successful, we also don't know how we can fight it. But let me start with a very basic statement, which nevertheless is not made often enough. Populism is successful where people are not happy. Happy people very, very rarely vote for populist parties. Right? And as a consequence, populism is to a large extent reactive. That's important, because that means that there was something before it that to a certain extent created it. Now there are two solutions these days that we have seen, or let me say, there are two strategies that politicians have used to defeat populism. Both have, to a certain extent, success, but I think that they're misguided, and they mainly have short-term success for the establishment, but long-term lead to long-term weakening of liberal democracy. So the first one is the anti-populism. And this is actually Hillary Clinton's strategy. And in anti-populism, almost what you do is you adopt populism, but you just change who is good and who is bad. And so Trump challenged the system by being the voice of the people, the pure ones, right, against the establishment. And as soon as Hillary Clinton saw that Trump was her opponent, and she by and large just bought into the liberal outrage, and her whole campaign now became about we are the good ones and the Trump people are the bad ones. As a consequence of that, Clinton's campaign was more negative than Trump's campaign, which is pretty impressive. And it was less focused on issues by the time that she took on Trump than Trump's campaign, which of course already was not very much focused on issues. Now, it's not unimportant to remind people that, of course, Clinton did win the popular vote. Right? This argument that Trump is the voice of the people or the majority is wrong. But the campaign was unsuccessful. And I think one of the problems of anti-populism is that it doesn't mobilize enough. It might be shared by a lot of people, but very few people will come out because of it. The other strategy came from my home country by Mark Rutte, who is the leader of the Conservative Party in the Netherlands, who claimed after he had won the elections, even though he had lost massively compared to the previous election, that good populism had defeated bad populism. And this is something what you see a lot now. And the argument is, well, you can't beat populism, right? Because the people want simplistic solutions, and if we come up with complex solutions to it, no one will vote for us. So we need to be populist too, but be better at it. Now, first of all, the odd thing is Rutte actually wasn't that populist. Rutte was nativist. They're not the same. Right? Many populist parties are also nativist. These are the populist radical right parties like Front National or Geert Wilders. But there are also populist parties that are not nativist, left-wing populist parties like Syriza or Podemos. What Rutte really did in his campaign was work on xenophobia and Islamophobia. Actually, he wasn't so much anti-elite. He wasn't so much pro the people. But the whole assumption that populism can't be beaten, like, is already empirically wrong. In almost every single country, as was just noted, like the vast majority of people vote for non-populist parties. But by adopting populism just to get elected, and even if you then throw it away once you're in power, you nevertheless strengthen the assumptions about politics of the populists. You strengthen the idea that all the elite are corrupt. You strengthen the idea that the people are homogeneous. And you strengthen the idea that the people are always right. And so, as a consequence, there's a chance that a larger group of the population will demand those types of policies. Policies that can satisfy the people. And of course you can't, because the people are not homogeneous. The people exist, the population exists of different groups of people with different interests and different values. And politics is about compromise. But if you have strengthened the illusion that you can make policies that are good for everyone, and that are good for everyone in an equal measure, then you will always fail. And so, I think that the solution is different, but it's also very difficult. First of all, because the reasons for the current populist search are largely structural, and they're not going to change. So what are some of the reasons that populists are successful? First of all, because many people perceive the political establishment, different parties, as being essentially all the same. And not addressing major issues adequately. These are perceptions that are often have a core of truth. Right? There were issues in the 80s and 90s that were barely or not discussed in many countries. Immigration, European integration are examples of that. There was no debate about it. In part because in certain countries, leadership came together and kept it off the political agenda. In other cases, because they just agreed. European integration, there was no conspiracy, everyone was just in favor of it. But a part of the population wasn't and didn't feel that there was a voice. The other part is, it's also true that in many issues, parties have become much more similar. If you look at the difference between SPD and CDU, for example, today, or think about the difference between Blair and Cameron and compare that to the difference between the Tories and Labour in the 70s. Right? They're much more similar, and to a large extent they're much more similar because of the EU. Because the EU sets very clear boundaries to what is possible, at least what is possible within the EU. So these are two of the key arguments that populists will use, right? They don't talk about our issues, and they're all the same. As said, there is a core there, but of course the parties aren't exactly the same, and it does matter who wins the elections today in Britain, for example. Whether you have a government of Labour or Tories is different, but it isn't different in the same way as it used to be. And I think one of the main problems is that political parties largely still campaign as if they still have all that space. They often campaign not just as if they're not going to be in a coalition together, but actually as if they're going to have this totally open space of politics, and as if there is no EU that sets boundaries to what you can and cannot do. Another reason why populism is successful now is what Ronald Inglehart has called cognitive mobilization. People are better educated today, but most importantly, they have much more self-confidence, what is called efficacy in the literature, which means that more and more people hold politicians accountable. They no longer just believe whatever they say. In fact, nowadays, they kind of, as a basic position, don't believe it. Now, this is to a certain extent problematic, but it's also good, because obviously all of our democratic models are based on independent citizens that critically assess their leaders and vote on the basis of their own reasoning and argumentation. But it also creates problems. Being a politician today is much, much harder than being a politician in the 50s or 60s. You no longer can assume that what you say will be taken at word. I was thinking at some of the politicians that are nowadays becoming legendary from the 60s or 70s, because those were people that stood for something. And that's true, and I'm thinking, it won't tell you anything, but a Dutch social democratic leader, Joop den Uyl, who was in the 70s the leader, and who is now seen as someone who stood for his principles and whatever. But Joop den Uyl would be killed in today's political climate. His paternalism, his arrogance towards voters would simply not work anymore. And one of the reasons why it doesn't work is because we have a very different media environment. Now, I'm not so much talking about social media, even though it is important, but particularly within a West European context, the US is a little bit different. In the 60s, 70s, up until the 80s almost, almost all of the media were either state-controlled or party trade union controlled. They had a phenomenal gatekeeper function. Most people also only read pretty much one source. And the major logic of the media was not making money. It was either providing good news or providing good news for your group. Today, of course, private media dominate pretty much every country. I think Germany is one of the few where a majority of people still watch news at ARD and ZDF. But in many other countries, the majority of the people get their news from private media. Private media that are dependent upon advertisement, which means that they chase eyeballs. They need people. And what sells? Scandal, conflict. And that is what populists provide. And so this new media structure, on the one hand, has much weaker gatekeepers and has a logic in which populists, at least at this point in time, are attractive. On top of that, we have attractive populists. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands was one of the first politicians who understood the power of Twitter, and who dominated Dutch politics on the basis of Twitter. He actually never gave interviews. He only tweeted. Not these kind of emotional, like Twitter storms of Trump. No, 1 or 2 a day. And then the media would run with that tweet to another politician and said, oh, Geert Wilders just tweeted that. What do you think of this? And they responded, and everyone started to talk about what Geert Wilders wanted to talk about. They never really asked anything what he meant by that, because he never gave interviews. Right? Beppe Grillo had the most popular political blog in Italy. Heinz Christian Strache has a very successful leader of the FPÖ, a very successful Facebook page. Right? So what you see is that various populist leaders are very good at social media. But social media alone isn't enough. Like, Donald Trump is often used as that example of the social media made him. First of all, it was the traditional media that made Trump into a social media star. It was The Apprentice, it was being on regular television that made him a household name, that made people decide to follow him on Twitter. Then once on Twitter, where he had over 1 million followers, he could create the impression that he was a story. But that story only became really relevant for the US election because it was picked up by traditional media. He was on CNN pretty much every single time. Right? Now, again, social media help. If you are a sensation on social media, the traditional media will almost certainly jump on you. But if they don't, then you remain only within your own group. Like, in the end, social media is primarily people following. And so the initiative is already there. You don't follow someone to be convinced about something. You're convinced, and that's why you follow. So it is that breaking out, using the social media to get into the traditional media. Now, so as I said, almost all of these things are structural. Like, they're not changing. Social media isn't changing. We're not going back to a state media kind of world. People remain this critical. But at the same time, this is also not a linear trend. So if you think, for example, about populists are attractive at the moment because they shake up the world. But after a while, populists are no longer that interesting. When they're long around, they don't shake up that much anymore. And they lose media attention. Like, we actually saw that in Belgium already with the Vlaams Belang several years ago, which had been around for 3 decades. And kind of the same message. And news is news, right? And if you have heard Philip de Winter say the same thing over and over again, it just doesn't sell in the same way. And then Bart de Wever came from the N-VA, which is not a populist party, but he offered something new, also kind of shocking, not populist, but more news. And the media went there. I think one of the most fascinating things about this year is actually not the election of Macron to president, but it's what is about to happen in the parliamentary election. If the polls are correct, Macron's party is going to wipe out pretty much all the other parties. Now, winning in the presidential election is not that difficult against a populist radical right politician. But in this election, the parliamentary election, there's no particular reason. We actually don't talk about the French parliamentary elections at all, or about the British election, about any election, since the populists are no longer a big, like, not going to win. We don't find it interesting. But if we were to talk about it, we wouldn't talk about Marine Le Pen. Total sideshow for this election, right? Why? Because Macron is a news story. So the point that I want to make about that is that this new context of the media helped populism in a certain structure, but not forever, right? It can help new actors. It doesn't have to be populist actors. It can be other actors as well. The fact that many of the populists actually profited from it had to do with the fact that they were the only ones who offered something. And so, to me, that is the key point. The key point is, first of all, you shouldn't be busy with defeating populists. That's way too narrow an agenda. Again, populists become successful because liberal democracy is perceived as failing. The best way to overcome that is to strengthen liberal democracy. If you strengthen liberal democracy, then by definition, populism will be weaker. How do you do that? First of all, by actually defending liberal democracy. When we speak about democracy, we almost only speak about popular sovereignty and majority rule, which creates the impression that if the majority wants something, they should get it, which is exactly what populists argue. Which also means that if you defend minority rights, it's kind of shady. Like, because the majority wants something, why don't we do it? Because minority rights or because of the EU? So defend liberal democracy, argue why there are minority rights, why there is rule of law, why there is separation of powers. Argue that minorities can become majorities and majorities can become minorities. The idea is now that minority rights are for certain groups. They will never be for you, right? Obviously, liberal democracy protects all. And so it's important to explain the liberal part of the system. Second of all, we need to have ideologies again. Almost every party these days is so-called pragmatic. Obviously, Tony Blair started that with the third way, but many on the right have the same. Mark Rutte literally said, I don't have anything with visions, right? Now, that might be the case for politicians, but that is fine if things go well. If things go well, we don't need visions. But if things don't go so well, we do like visions. We do like to see that you know what you want to do and why. At this point in time, we don't get that. We have politicians from Merkel to Sarkozy to Cameron who say that multiculturalism has failed. But they still support a multicultural policy. We have every politician on the earth these days saying that the European Union is not working out as it should have been and that the gap between Brussels and that is too big. But we have no one, except of people like Verhofstadt who are irrelevant, who have a vision for a different Europe. Except, of course, the populists. They have visions, and they say, oh, this EU, sure, they set boundaries, but if we don't like it, we get out of it. And that is the point here. In the end, I strongly believe that the vast majority of people are looking for a liberal democratic option. But they need the ideology and they need competence and leadership. Like, the politician who has been written off most probably over the last decade is Angela Merkel. Now, leaving aside that I think there's a sexism to that, it's not by accident that this is a female politician. Angela Merkel is a phenomenon. Like, she's going to get about 40% of the vote while being in power for a very, very long time. Why is that? Sure, Germany is doing well, but the Netherlands is doing well too. But Rutte doesn't say that the Netherlands is doing well. Merkel does. Merkel might not be a visionary, but she's fairly predictable. You know what you get, and she sticks to certain points. Right? I think that is leadership, and I think that is being appreciated. It is important, there's nothing more profitable for populists than crisis, the perception of crisis rather than actual crisis. The refugee crisis was the reason why all those parties peaked in 2016. And it wasn't just because immigrants were coming in. Immigrants have been coming in for a long time, and in many countries, actually in larger numbers than in 2015. It was because it was perceived as a crisis, and all major parties acted as that. And by and large said, we don't know what to do. It's out of our hands. We can't do it at the national level. It's Europe. And the populists say, oh, we know. Like, we're closing the borders. And if this means that we have to get out of the EU, we'll get out of the EU. Right? Now, you shouldn't copy that, but you should also not say, you know what, we're going to close the borders, but like, we're going to stick within the same EU. Every single policy today, any vision, is not just a vision of going back. If you want to get, I still believe that there is a space for social democracy, for example. A bit skeptical about the parties. But you can't go back to the 60s, 70s. In part, as I have explained, people expect very different things from leaders. But also because social democracy today is within the EU. And so any vision for a new social democracy means that you have to have a vision about the European Union, which is compatible with your vision of social democracy. That we're missing. Instead, we get all kinds of policies that are ad hoc and that are not convincing because they don't fit in the overall structure. So I think we should get away from the TINA politics. There is no alternative. We have to stick with austerity because the alternative is worse. We have to stay in the EU because otherwise we have the Holocaust, right? And we have to get back into an ideological position which is modern, which deals with contemporary structure, but also which dares to lead again, rather than just follow the people. Thank you.
So, should be working. Cas Mudde, thank you very much for your keynote. We thought we'd continue here on the podium in a more comfortable way. We have two commentators, and Christina, you will start. We think around 10 minutes, maybe commenting on the keynote, but also maybe giving your view on possible solutions and how to react on the challenge.
I think it works, yes. Thank you very much for the possibility to be here, and thanks, Cas, for the for your first keynote. And I'm quite glad that in a lot of ways the European Union was considered in your speech, because because as a researcher who is dealing with the European Union, I'm very interested in what populism does to the European integration process. And I think in your speech there was sort of a hidden thought, maybe I'm a bit over-exaggerating, that populists will lose attention after a while, and they will not last forever. So we have to do things, but it will sort of fade after a while. But actually Brexit stays with us, so there are serious effects, current and future effects of populism. So so I would like to a little bit elaborate and maybe stretch our subject a little bit with the question of why the European Union is the prime target of populism. Obviously, all of us know that the European Union was established to provide an effective framework for nation states in Europe to cooperate in order to prevent war after the Second World War, and the solution how to do it was the pooling of resources and also parts of sovereignty. And the approach of doing it is a very technocratic and policy-based and policy-centered set of institutions, and also a highly complex institutional system where power is very much dispersed, and really you don't see leaders, and the roles of decision makers are not very clear-cut, and it is also highly cooperative. Now, populism is everything that goes against this approach. I think the framework for populism is the nation state, is what the member states of the European Union. Main consideration is what is happening within. It's, I think, a highly closed concept, as I see usually the arguments. Sovereignty is a key issue for populist argument. So maybe we are in the populist era. We may be living in a post nation state order. Populism is also post-factual, whereas the European Union is very, very much factual. Sometimes nerve-wrackingly factual, I think, because every conflict has to be downgraded into a legal or a policy issue, and politics is very much excluded from the operations. On the other hand, the literature on the European Union is full of the concept of politicization. But I think you have to be a researcher in order to identify that, because I guess the everyday citizen, I think, enjoys the politicized European Union only with a magnifying glass. So what to do with this problem of what populism does, and how populist parties deal with the European Union, how to fight back? I think I don't know the solutions, but I know that there should be at least two players who should do this. And usually we expect European institutions to give responses and step out of their frame of logic, concentrating on policy approaches and become political. But obviously, an institution that for 60 years have been operating on the basis of this policy and technocratic approach cannot change from one time to another. So I think exactly what you said, member states, liberal democratic parties should get in the debate and argue actually for the European Union that we don't do. We still think that this permissive consensus is still with us, that while people actually don't care or don't really have opinions about the European Union, so we don't have to stress what the European actually does for the everyday citizen. But I think it is actually time to start arguing for that. And I think this might be sort of the benefit of the populist challenge to change our everyday reactions. Thanks.
So András, your 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. My name is András Bozóki, commenting Professor Cas Mudde. A couple of unrelated thoughts, I mean unrelated to each other, not to his ideas and not to his speech and writing. So one thing is, I was thinking whether populist politicians are staying populist or not for a long time. As you said, after a while people get bored, you know, always the same guy. And if suddenly an Emmanuel Macron emerges, then the populist star is finished. Unless you control the media. So some authoritarian populists control the media in order to propagandize all the time his own policies. So in Western Europe, populists might come and go, but in Eastern Europe, authoritarian populists try to control the media to keep this populist moment as long as possible. And thinking about, for instance, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who used to be a liberal, but started his leadership as a populist leader in some ways, populism, nationalism. And 5 years ago, maybe more people described him as a true populist. He was also searching for topics. He said that the nation cannot be in opposition. He unilaterally changed the constitution, etc., etc. He's had a qualified majority. But, and then picking the capital punishment issue, and then the refugee crisis, etc. And now I think he is more seen as a illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian leader rather than a populist leader. So to what extent populism is a way to get to power and to stay in power for a while, but it cannot stay very long. At one point you have to decide whether you are a majoritarian Democrat or Democrat at all, or you move towards authoritarianism. And if there is no strong civil society, no strong democratic political culture, there is a big temptation for a leader not to be populist anymore, but simply anti-democratic, authoritarian. And it's also interesting, a student of mine is writing on the Turkish case and Erdogan, and actually he is here, so he will be commenting and asking questions, but I think it's interesting that Erdogan started his career as a voice of the voiceless, supporting the Kurdish issue, the minorities. So he emerged as a sort of organic populist leader from the peripheries, attacking the Atatürk tradition of secularism and nationalism in the name of Islam and tradition. And he changed himself, turned to be a mainstream populist leader. But now he is an unquestionable leader of Turkey. So is he still a populist, or he is just another despotic leader? So to what extent a populist needs to be popular? And if a populist needs to be popular, why does he need martial law? Interestingly, even, and now it seems contradictory, populist illiberal leaders like to have elections because they need legitimacy. So they try to mobilize people time to time. And they need more than ever propaganda machinery controlling the media, advertising and the propaganda machinery. So I am old enough to compare the current situation with the late Kádár period, the late communist period in Hungary, which was a relatively goulash communist period. There was no mobilization. It was like classic Juan Linz, you know, depoliticization, atomization, don't talk about politics, just obey. And comparing to the late communist period, there is an incredibly feverish propaganda campaign time to time in Hungary, most visibly against the refugees. That is called migrants. That was unknown in the Hungarian language basically, but it was introduced by the government propaganda. So it seems that ethnicism, nativism, hatred towards foreigners, Islamophobia, is it populism? In the meantime, also anti-feminism, anti-gender, attacking Western institutions like this university, attacking Brussels. At least in Western Europe, the new populists include the feminists, the gay people, to defend them from the so-called Islamic danger. But here it is not that big coalition. There are different fronts and different enemies of illiberalism. So just because somebody is anti-core, anti-liberal democratic, and want to extract as much as possible from the state for themselves and their family, political family, this is the theory of mafia state, does it qualify the person as populist? Because he is not an assimilationist nationalist anymore, an ethnicist, an excluding, not including but excluding. And populism somehow promises inclusion, that you are also part of the people, like Perón did in Argentina, everybody is part of the people. Now these guys don't do this, so the politics of exclusion is very, very, very strong. And I completely agree with you that there are even neoliberal populism, neoliberal policies to go together with populist rhetoric and populist political strategy. So it is not necessarily left-wing economically. So populism can go very comfortably with democratic, anti-democratic, liberal, and other ideas, neoliberal, which is economic ideology, and even far-right ideas. So while I agree with you that populists can govern and can stay in power, I think maybe that is just a contingency, that audience and people have to learn how to use social media. They have to learn the interplay between traditional media and social media, as they had to learn how television works after the Second World War. So maybe if people get more mature and this technological innovations do not confuse them, maybe they will learn how to treat these guys and they will just come and go within a populist moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the two comments. Both were totally on time. Cas Mudde, well, I think probably you would like to react, but I would also to focus it a little bit. And I would like to focus it on two questions. In the opening remarks, it was mentioned, if you look in the international media, when it was a lot about populism, was mostly Western European countries. But there was the thesis, if you look on Central Eastern European countries, maybe their populism is much bigger or much stronger, especially here in Hungary. If you look, well, maybe we have also to say which are populist parties or which are not populist parties in Hungary. But if you count in Fidesz and Jobbik, you have almost 70% of the votes for those parties, so it's very strong. So is it, is it just a special case, an outlier, or is it something new, a role model, and also a danger which connects to your thesis or on the future of the European Union?
Yeah. It's always difficult to generalize on the basis of one case. And so, like you had the Budapest model, like that Kaczynski used, and from that perspective it seemed as if Hungary was the way forward. But I think there are massive differences between Hungary and Poland. First and foremost is, of course, that Poland has an opposition, which is not unimportant, because one of the things that, again, in the debate about the strength of populism, we read way too much in the strength of populism. In many countries, populists do win very large portions of the ones that vote, but not very many people vote, right? Which is already that their electorate is often at best 25% of the eligible voters, right? Now what you see is that, think about Erdogan or think about Orban, right? Those are clearly the most successful politicians in their country, but they're also facing completely divided oppositions, which often have massive problems with legitimacy in the eyes of large portions of the population, which gives them a lot of time to create a system in which you by and large can't lose elections anymore. I mean, Turkey is there. I wouldn't be surprised if Hungary is one election away from that. Poland, on the other hand, might break it already in the next election because there's an opposition. But if you look at other countries, you actually see a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe which don't have particularly strong populist parties. Estonia, Latvia, even Lithuania, very comparable to West European countries, if not smaller. We also forget that, like, Switzerland has already for a very long time the strongest populist radical right party, the SVP. Italy has a very long tradition, as has Greece, of pretty much a majority voting for populist parties. So I'm a bit uncomfortable by making this, again, an East-West division. And I think that we have to be careful in that. Now, I want to pick up on one point that's a bit related to is that Andras said, that is like, here we have populists that don't even have some kind of, at least some progressive traits, of inclusive traits, right? With the gay agenda and feminism. Now, there's no radical right populist party includes feminists. They include gender equality, but they're definitely anti-feminist. Some of them include the gay agenda. This has nothing to do with liberal values. Like Geert Wilders doesn't support a liberal agenda. For Geert Wilders, gay rights is Dutch culture. Like, it's part of nationalism. Like, what we see actually is that most populist parties have really no particular gender position. What they have is a position that is in line with what roughly the mainstream holds on gender, which in the Netherlands and Denmark, like, sounds very progressive, but within the Dutch context, the PVV's gender position is not progressive. It's actually the status quo. if not a little bit less. Denmark, the same thing. I think it's very important to separate populism from nativism, from xenophobia, as an ideology. Most, if not all, populist actors are not only populist. Like Syriza is populist and socialist in some way, as is Podemos. Their success is related to both aspects. Front National cannot be understood without nativism. But it is significant that today nativism is primarily linked to populism, whereas in the 20s, 30s, it was mainly linked to elitism. And even within the 60s, 70s, it wasn't. And so I think we should use the term populism, but we shouldn't see everything that populist actors do as being a consequence of populism. And as a last point with Brexit, yes, Brexit will stay with us, right? It doesn't have to be bad. I know this is like a shock for you guys, but there are actually many arguments to be made against the EU from a liberal democratic point of view, from a social democratic point of view, and I can make them for hours. Brexit was not a populist vote. It was populism that helped it achieve a majority. But the main campaign came not out of UKIP, came out of the Tories. The main arguments had to do with national sovereignty, which weren't really that populist. Brexit can work, and can, at the moment it clearly isn't working, right? But Brexit is not the same as Trump. I take this personal because I live under Trump. And I can assure you I would prefer to live under Brexit than under Trump. Brexit is a consequence of the strength of populism, who set the agenda, who pushed through, right? But it isn't only populism. And this goes to a broader agenda. A lot of things that we liberal Democrats consider that are bad, xenophobia, homophobia, Euroscepticism, whatever it is, yes, populists push this, but many within the mainstream do too. Like, it isn't because of the populist that Central and Eastern Europe is homophobic. Right? Central and Eastern Europe is insanely homophobic. And that goes well into virtually every party and well into virtually every religion. Right? And so populists adopt that too. Right? But they don't create it. Right? To a large extent, they are rather the voice of something that is there and has been created by Democrats.
Because of this nativism, move away from classic populism, people tend to see some leaders as elitist. So those leaders who used to be populists are now seen as members of the new elite, or they always were. So I mentioned this notion of organic populists who are coming from below or from the margins. Others were always extremely rich, like Berlusconi, so it is always belonged to the elite, like Donald Trump always belonged to the economic or whatever elite. Some thinkers play with the idea of elitist populism, when the elite consciously using populism as a strategy for their own survival. But that's a camouflage. It is not a populism, because they have different class-oriented policies, you know, neoliberal flat tax for the rich and public work for the poor and for the homeless. So what do you think? Is there such thing as we all knew that elitism and populism were twin brothers. Sometimes elitism provoked populism, populism provoked elitism, but is there such thing that elitist populism?
There is populism by elites, right? I don't think there's elitist populism. Elitism is the mirror image of populism. Elitists also see the people as homogeneous and the elite as homogeneous, but they think that the elite are virtuous and the people are corrupt, right? But almost all the successful populist leaders are kind of insider-outsiders. And so, or outsider-insiders, they're people who are within the broader, the better off, I mean, elite establishment, but within that group, they're just outside. Donald Trump is a very good example. Right? Donald Trump clearly was born into wealth, right? But he was never really part of the political and economic elite in New York City and New York State. It was always a bit frowned upon, as was his father. Right? Orban has a chip on his shoulder about that not being really accepted by the Budapest elite. But they don't come really from the margin. That's very rare. Right? Erdogan, probably one of the few. Sarah Palin actually was also someone who was really from outside. But almost all of them, Geert Wilders, right, comes out of the mainstream party, was a parliamentarian for a very long time, Silvio Berlusconi, all those kind of examples. But they sell that they are outsiders, and they do that on the basis of their values. Right? It's not about whether you have money. It's about, are you, in terms of your values, connected to the people, or are you in your values connected to the elite? And so Donald Trump, for example, is very proud about the fact that he will eat his steak like, well done, pretty much like without any blood left in it. And you can say, well, that's irrelevant. That's actually not irrelevant, because it's very frowned upon, right, by all of the real connoisseurs who know that like you should never kill your steak by over-grilling it. But those types of critiques is what he lives off. Like the fact that he eats at McDonald's and everyone is like making fun of him of, look at him, he just gets a Big Mac, right? And he will use that and say, look, this is because I'm like you, right? I don't do what I'm expected to do by the elites, by the cultural elites with their cosmopolitan values. I live like you. Sure, I'm a millionaire, billionaire, right? But deep down, I'm still the same. Of course, this is an American context too. Like, unlike Central and Eastern Europe or even Western Europe, Americans don't frown upon wealth. Right? That's not a negative. But what is more important is that what he argues is that that wealth hasn't changed the fact that I'm still in values like you, not like the Volvo driving, latte sipping like elites, which is the American interpretation.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Just one sentence about Brexit. I very much agree that populism has been a catalyst for Brexit. It's always been there. This special sort of way out of the European Union. In the 1980s, there was already a book published by a British professor with the title "Britain, the Awkward Partner," in the European community. So it's always been so. But I guess these kind of problems or features in the society, as you said, they are being enlarged by populist political forces.
So I would like to turn now a little bit to the strategies, how to react to responses. And I mean, you were talking about this anti-populism strategy, like Hillary Clinton, then this example from your home country, this good populism versus bad populism. Then you explained a little bit the structure, the reasons for the rise of populism, and then giving some, let's say, ideas how to react on it. If I try to make the bridge to Hungary, and you're saying, okay, one reason is there's no choice. All the parties are the same, and we need more ideologies, we need more explanation for liberal democracy. If we look in Hungary on the left liberal party scene, I would say there's a big choice. Yeah? There are many parties. Maybe the problem is that you can't really distinguish them very good, but we have a new party momentum coming up, which are new, which are young, and who I think try to say we don't have an ideology. We are neither left nor right, and we want to do everything different. So is this a contradiction to what you were saying, or would it fit in your explanation?
To me, those kind of options of we have now no ideology, we're just new and we do stuff differently, that works short term, never works long term, because first of all, you're not doing everything different. You can't, because you work within the same structures as everyone else, and so you're going to do a lot exactly the same as everyone else. But I honestly think that the Hungarian situation is very, very dark. Because there isn't a clear oppositional alternative, and like I'm all the time thinking back at the 1990s and Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia. Right? And Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia was not even near as powerful as Orban is. Always had coalition governments, always had to wiggle because he was also on an accession trail, right? But he started to undermine liberal democracy, and he's particularly started to affect the level playing field increasingly. At a certain point in time, the EU said, like, if you continue like this, you're not going to be in the first accession group. That was the moment that finally all the opposition parties understood that the next election was simply about Mečiar, right? And they won. Mečiar went. We didn't expect that. But he sang a sad song and then left. Now, Hungary is far beyond that moment. Far beyond that moment. Like the power that Mečiar had, he tried to gerrymander a couple of things. It went nowhere, right? The fact that I think you're a year before a crucial election and there's nowhere near any type of, from what I can see, realization that the next election is simply about continuing Orban in power and giving him 4 more years to dismantle pretty much any chance of you winning the election again. Like, to me, Hungary is the last stand. Right? And so now is not the question about social democracy, Christian democracy. The next election should be of a liberal democratic camp versus the Fidesz camp. Or even, actually, because you don't have a majority in a liberal democratic camp, pretty much an anti-Orban camp so that Jobbik can be integrated. Because that is the only thing you have, right? But however dark that is, of course, the vast majority of other countries don't have that. Like, on average, populist parties win about 19% of the vote, and actually it's even less, right? And so in most countries, the populist party is the 3rd biggest party. And I respond to that. That means that there is more than enough space to advance your liberal democratic agenda, and that is where I mean it. But I think, honestly, Hungary, the next election is just about Orban or not.
Thanks. Now I'm wondering if our Hungarian commentators agree that there should be a kind of 2 camps election, or is there, because in the beginning you said populism is rising where people are not happy, and I think Hungary, there were some reasons to be not happy about also the government before Orban. So.
Yeah, although there are some new parties in Hungary, the other problem is the old parties don't disappear. So they are still there from the early 90s, and there are some signs which suggest that those are, or some personalities from those parties are corrupted and compromised by Fidesz. So the game is not clean. The competition is not real in several aspects. So among the opposition parties, you have to differentiate between the real opposition and the fake opposition. And that is problem. I mean, at least it would be good to see a real opposition vis-à-vis Orban. That is one point. The other point is the role of Jobbik, which is now the hottest issue in the Hungarian opposition side, whether to pick Jobbik or not, form a technical coalition, change the electoral rule, and then have a temporary government against Fidesz. And many people who remember with the Hungarian Guard, Magyar Garda, and violence, paramilitary forces, Jobbik started as a neo-Nazi or neo-fascist group. And for many good Democrats, it is just inconceivable. But on the other hand, you know, in politics, you cannot choose with whom you are talking to. So if Democrats want to create a broad coalition against an increasingly authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regime, they will need all possible votes. So pragmatically, I think it is a must. And in the meantime, there is an interesting change between the positions of Jobbik and Fidesz, because Fidesz went too far to the right in the last two and a half, 3 years. Particularly, they started this vehement campaign against the migrants. So they really easily picked this Islamophobia, and because they never were an anti-Semitic party. Fidesz never was an anti-Semitic party, but Jobbik started as an anti-Semitic party, so it took more time for them to reconfigure their minds from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia. They couldn't do the two things together at the same time. So Jobbik, it seems they don't find their place on the far right, so they try to move to be a people's party on the center right. So maybe the trends suggest that Fidesz is moving out to the far right and Jobbik is moving closer to the center, and they behave differently, they are professionalized, they are not talking against Roma crime anymore, so there is some moderation. And the question is whether the other participants of the democratic opposition will consider Jobbik as this move as a honest move, or it is just a show during the campaign. So it is still unclear, but I think at the end of the day this will happen. Moreover, there are further rivalries between the socialists and the Democratic Coalition, former Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány. So there are a lot of individual narcissism as well, which makes things more difficult.
I would like to go back to your comparison about mature Slovakia and current Hungary. I think there is also, at the Center of Enlargement Studies, we can go back to another player, the European Union here, because at that moment, the principle of conditionality had a very strong effect on internal politics, at that time Slovakia. Hungary, as a member state of the European Union, is enjoying what we know of enlargement fatigue, although 13 years after the accession to the European Union, we should not talk about enlargement anymore because it was such a long time ago. But still, although we should not expect saving our democracy from outside, but the European Union as a community of values also has a responsibility, and there are signs of Article 7 and other member state democracy procedures, but not only the European institutions, but the European parties also should have a say in that, like the European People's Party, whose party family has a member that is called Fidesz at the moment. So I think the European Union should have something to do in this problem as well. Obviously not wanting to blame everything on them, as the Hungarian opposition has the prime responsibility of what's going on in this country.
Thanks. Last question before we open the floor. I'm still not too much convinced, because I have the feeling by only saying we have to explain more liberal democracy, and it's the liberal democracy against the populist or illiberal democracy. As you said, there's a reason why populism is rising, and that there are many people had the feeling that the major issues are not addressed anymore, and that the European Union is too far away, etc. So shouldn't there be also a kind of self-criticism of the let's call it the liberal democratic camp, and maybe also rethinking their own positions, and also thinking, how do we address the issue of migration or security? And shouldn't this be that we need also some new ideas from those mainstream parties, as we might see tonight with Corbyn, who is on, I would say, a kind of outlier inside his own party so far?
Yeah, I'm almost shocked that that didn't come through. Yes, we need a lot of critique, self-critique and self-reflection. Like, we're increasing, the stronger populists become, the more we're starting to glorify the period before, as if everything was great, like, at that point in time. And it's actually, even recently, there was this debate about in the US, which is stronger than in Western Europe, but there are similarities about how everything is worse now, right? Yeah, tell that to an African American, right? Or to women, or to gays. Like, there's been a lot of progress. There are certain groups that have lost over the last couple of years, right? But the other thing is that we act as if liberal democracy was functioning perfectly, right? We act as if liberal democracy never had any repression. Right? So now we criticize populists when they get to power for limiting freedom of speech. Wasn't freedom of speech limited before? Of course it was. Right? As I said, certain issues were kept out of debate or were very sanitized. Right? In the Netherlands in the 1980s, the immigration debate was very, very narrow. And so I think we have to be honest about that, as we have to be honest about what choices were made, right? People chose to make a Eurozone. I think it's pretty clear that most people who made that choice had no idea what the consequences were. Now we know, right? Populists say, you see, that's all bad. We say, well, this is what it is and we have to move on. Time new to say, okay, so clearly we didn't know what happened, right? It's now there. It's still good for these and these reasons. Like, I'm actually a recovering anti-EU person. Like, I'm now slowly getting into the Eurosceptic one. And so far from me to defend the European Union, but the European Union is a reality, right? Whether you like it or not, and I said I don't, but I live with it every day. I want to understand why. Why do I have that? This argument, like, well, we don't have war. I mean, sorry, I don't buy it. Like, we don't have war because we have NATO, not because of the EU. The EU has nothing to do with military. We have progress, do we? Like, because the idea was always that, like, we were going to share our wealth with the South, and they haven't really gotten that much. Whereas our poor in the North have become relatively poorer, right? Explain to me why. Like, if you're going to say, we're going to do this because we have to stick within the EU framework, don't say because we have to stick in the EU framework. Say why you want to stick within the EU framework, right? And so I think that's crucial. I think we should explain why we do things. Because the other thing that it does is it shows that we're not victims, that we don't just do things because there are stronger forces. No, we made the decision, right, to get into the system, and we stay within it because it's still better for where we want to go, right? The same with globalization. There's also this kind of argument, like, oh, well, we have to do this because of globalization. Like, first of all, it doesn't mean anything because it's just a vague, vague term. But either globalization determines everything, and then you shouldn't claim that the economy is doing better because of your smart policies, right? or it is a context within you have a more limited space, but you still have space to make choices. Right? And so I think that in that sense, it is important to be self-critical, but it's also important to stand again for what you believe in, and not just sell it by saying, well, there is no alternative, or the alternative is worse. Right?
Yes, for self-criticism, there was a lot of arrogance about the economic transformation. So neoliberalism was presented as there is no alternative. Tina, we know better how to do. So economists were the wisest people considered in the 1990s in the economic transformation. So a lot of liberals did not think of the consequences of the fast, spontaneous privatization, the social injustices. So there was an early populist party in Hungary, the smallholders party, that was totally ridiculed, which tried to represent some countryside interests. So yes, and the Hungarian elites and the East European elites were waiting for the so-called Europeanization, which the negotiations with the EU, how the EU make us good Europeans. So there was a lot of inferiority complex also in the behavior of the post-communist new democratic elites at that time. And this blind belief in neoliberal economics collapsed after 2008. And there was no other alternative seen as neoliberalism, so Fidesz just occupied this political vacuum even more easily with economic nationalism and so on. But I think we were already talking a bit much, and maybe we should ask the audience to ask some questions, if you agree.
First, Christina,
or first, Christina, you want? Sorry. Sorry.
Okay. Actually, I don't have a solution, so I don't know why I'm sitting here, but I have a question to Cas about his solution. Because I have the feeling that your proposal to strengthen liberal democracy with arguments and reasoning is you can score certain goals, but I think the match is played in a different stadium. Because I think that you can have rational reasoning for your own arguments, but if the person you are arguing with is just saying that George Soros is a bad person, then there is no space for a debate. So I would like to do what you do, but I don't see how it works.
I'm going to be very, very short. But I mean, again, I can't help you in Hungary. There are so many reasons for that. But by selling your idea, right, you can't win. One of the reasons why mainstream parties have not been able to win is because the agenda was set by the populists, which meant that we spoke about their issues, but more importantly, within their frames, right? So we actually, because you can talk about immigration in all kinds of different ways, but if we're talking about it as a threat to our culture, then we're always going to lose that debate. But in the last Dutch election, as an example, like the issues of immigration, integration, and security were the top 3 issues for PVV voters, for Wilders voters. None of these 3 issues was in the top 3 for any of the other voters, right? Which is 87% of the population. The whole campaign was about these 3 issues. One of the reasons why Marine Le Pen is struggling at the moment, one of the reasons why the FPÖ will be struggling, is because increasingly we're talking about other issues. And actually, if you look at polls, then the majority of the population isn't primarily busy with immigration or with refugees. They're increasingly busy with unemployment, with health care, right, with reform of the welfare state, and all those kind of education, a major issue as well. Right? And so it is also about reclaiming the agenda. If mainstream parties always respond to the issues and the frames of the populists, then you're lost. But if populists have to respond to a debate about education, right, they have very little to say. And they also are not trusted on those issues because they haven't proven themselves. But you can't out-nativist, like the nativists. And so if you're going to say, yeah, no, you're actually right, those immigrants are a bit of a threat, and I'm going to take care of it. I say, yeah, I go with that guy because he's saying it for 20 years already. Right? So I think that's important. I mean, Jean-Marie Le Pen said that in the 1990s. People prefer the original over the copy. Right? And sometimes the copy wins, but it's only for one election. The next time you will get the bill.
So thanks a lot. As promised, last half an hour is your half an hour. So I would like to collect questions. Also, I know it's not easy to pose a question in only one sentence, so I have patience for that. But also, please, as many people would like to pose the questions, it would be good not to be too long. So please raise your hands, then we like to collect. Start in the front and then the woman behind. Yeah, please.
My question is mainly regarding the self-criticism part of democratic liberalism. So I feel like in the last half-decade, populism is undoubtedly one of the most successful campaigning strategies. And it's very easy for many liberals to dismiss populism itself as a very sinister thing, as we've seen throughout tonight's debate as well. But in a way, I feel like maybe that is the answer to tonight's question as well. Maybe there is something to learn from populism for many liberal Democrats. And don't you feel like, this would be my question, do you feel like maybe there could be a populist movement for the EU, and using the media you could shape people's opinions into a very progressive and innovative movement that could be the answer to, you know, the populist challenge itself?
Thank you very much. Then behind. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and if you can give your name as well.
Yeah, I started with that. So I'm Isabel First, and I'm angry green independent city politician. And my question is to Professor Bozocki. I hope you don't think serious what your big show is not a show. I don't want to share the details, but in the private case, the prosecutors are investigating the leader of Magyar Garda. He was my advocate in the private case. So I managed to hunt down this guy.
One more.
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask about the connection with nationalism and national narratives, and specifically about how do you see the necessity and possibility of developing positive national narratives. Is it do you think it's a useful and necessary way to go, or it's kind of like a reactionary dead-end road? And I also would like to raise a related sub-question about related historic issues and potential orientalization or description of Central East Europe as a backwards place, like not really civilized, with negative stereotypes which can feed populism. And I finished the question just quoting the New York Times that I respect, but that managed to write in an editorial on April 7th in the first sentence that after muzzling a free press and shutting down some civil society groups, starting the editorial with two factual statements which are not true, at least in my view. So it's a complex question, but I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Who wants to start? Andras? Cas?
I already have made the argument that I don't think there is a good populism. Populism is by definition anti-liberal democracy. I think that we conflate way too much under that term. Also, it really is a misreading of the data to argue that populism is the successful technique. Like, on average, it is not even 20% of the people throughout Europe who vote for a populist party. So clearly the vast majority of people are still open to a non-populist response. Overall, populists often ask the right questions and provide the wrong answers to them. I think we shouldn't be so anal about it. Like, we too often judge issues on the basis of who says it. And as a consequence, we accept nativism from established parties, and we don't accept, let's say, pro-welfare policies because they come from the radical right. But I don't think you need a populist response, because populism is essentially, if it has any meaning, it is essentially that you homogenize the people and that you put politics on the basis of a moral distinction, and that undermines compromise, that undermines liberal democracy. Even though it wasn't directed at me, the Jobbik show question, I totally buy that. My point personally is that that is irrelevant. You don't have to embrace Jobbik. I mean, this is about pretty much a popular front, as in the 1920s and 30s, people worked together with the communists to fight the fascists until the fascists and the communists worked together. That's not the point here now. Like, it doesn't mean that you think that the communists were Democrats. They weren't, but they were the lesser of two evils. I don't think Hungary has the luxury to exclude all evils because they have the majority. Reclaiming nationalism is something that has been tried by many. Actually, particularly on social democracy, I remember Helmut Schmidt making this case already in the 90s. Billy Bragg, who is one of my heroes, a lefty British singer, protester, has written a whole book about patriotism, reclaiming England, and those kind of things. It's very popular at the moment among social democrats to be like left patriot or whatever. I don't know why we need it. Like, I mean, I thought we had class. Like, why doesn't class work? Like, it's very hard in a multicultural society to have a truly inclusive nationalism that doesn't exclude particular religious groups or ethnic groups. And if you go that far, this kind of civil nationalism is just generally not mobilizing too much. I think there's much more to be said around old school concepts of class and class solidarity. And the Orientalism is, I think, something that, I mean, the New York Times is full of it, not only about actually Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, I personally think all American media have a very, very odd view of Europe and individual countries. I mean, for 7, 8 years, there couldn't be an article written in the New York Times without a reference to Wilders. Even about debates where Wilders had never said anything about it, but for the New York Times, Dutch politics was about Wilders and the rest, right? They have these strong frames, but there is a broader idea that Central Eastern Europe wasn't ever really democratic, liberal democratic, and the West is. I think that's problematic. Again, I mean, just look at Italy. Italy has all kind of problems that we see here in this region as well. And there are countries in this region that perform well, right? Slovenia, are they not then part of that? And so I don't think it, yes, there are regional issues, but we shouldn't get too stuck in cultures.
Just one one sentence about whether it is possible to initiate a populist movement for the European Union. While the European Union, according to research and according to the history of the EU, has always been an elite project, run by the elites, loved by mostly the elite. So the elite prefers the European Union a lot more than the average citizen. So it should, if it was possible at all, it would be run by the elites, this populist movement. But since I don't think it's very rewarding in the member states, only this issue, I don't think it's very probable. But well, that's an idea. So.
But we have this pulse of Europe in many European countries now. I don't know if this is something which is a gathering of people and demonstrating in favor of the European Union. So
yeah.
It's
popular. Yes.
You can
Okay.
actually mobilize for something without being a populist.
Yes, as for Jobbik, I think as a non-Jobbik enthusiast, you can believe me, I think the question is very simple because the situation is as dark as Cas mentioned. I mean, do you want the Orban regime to stay for another 4 years or infinitely? Because we cannot have any guarantee for a democratic type of election in 2022. So why not to try to get rid of as early as possible? But this is a political strategy. This is only my citizen opinion. It is not a political scientist opinion. I think you need to have a broad coalition in order to change the regime. And it will be the job of the politicians to sit down with those guys and talk with them. So you don't have to do this. I don't have to do this. But some people who are the politicians, they have to make an agreement with those guys if they want to have a broad oppositional coalition. And about good and bad populism, of course, cannot be good populism if you have a liberal democracy, because it is a negation. But if you don't have a liberal democracy, then, as you also wrote with Kaltwasser in your book, there can have some positive effects. Like in Argentina, there was a liberal countryside oligarchy, and populism somehow put a stress on the system to open up and be more democratic and not so narrowly elitist. Or, as we all know, the 19th century Midwest United States populist movement was an agrarian farmer movement for greater participation, and it had a long-lasting impact on the US politics. Progressivism and Roosevelt welfare state projects and so on. And maybe in Russia, the populists were sort of educated intellectuals who tried to enlighten the uneducated people, so that was an enlightenment project. I mean, it did not hurt that much the Tsarist regime, but it was moving to the good direction. But these are just historical examples, so it is not to question your point, basically, concerning the present.
So we have time for one more round of questions. Any more? It's behind there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So we start behind.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, it seems to me that some of the people that you would describe as nativist right-wing populists all seem to share a certain, like Le Pen or Trump or Orban, all seem to share a certain degree of fascination with Putin's regime. Why do they all seem to like Putin so much? And does that give us a hint? I'm especially worried about the discussant's comments that populist regime is just a face over something else. Like, does that give us the idea where the whole train is actually potentially going? Should they be given the opportunity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then we had there, in the gray shirt.
My name is András Gál. I have a question of clarification to Cas Mudde primarily. So you mentioned in your keynote that you see the way out from this, ideological vacuum crisis of center parties as one solution, that they would embrace ideology in a more assertive manner. Now, did you mean this, primarily in an economic sense or in a more holistic way? Because, one has the reasons to assume that there's a lot of polarization out there in, let's say, cultural issues or other aspects of, programmatic ideologies.
Then there was the red shirt as well, the man in the black glasses.
Hello, my name is Mario Stava, and I wanted to ask about good populism and bad populism. I don't know if, for instance, Canadian Prime Minister can be clustered in any kind of populism by definition of Professor Cas Mudde, that he's using media, but not with a scandal, but with a soap opera. Still, he's every day in the media, he's trying to somehow identify himself with the Canadian society, with the flexibility, and still it's selling there. So, sorry for my ignorance, is this kind of a good populism, or is it also in your definition of grabbing the power and climbing the political ladder with a softer message and not that much polarization, but still it's kind of a strategy to get into the power. So how will put the Canadian example?
Okay, thank you. Then the last question was in the second row, in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Sebastian. It's been very interesting so far. I'm a bit surprised, though, that we haven't been talking about it yet, because if you look at the latest election results and referendum results in Europe, shouldn't we be talking more about one of the oldest cleavages between the rural and the urban population, the cities and the countryside?
Okay. I'm going to work backwards. The rural-urban cleavage, or at least electoral distinction, I think is absolutely fascinating. I actually wrote a paper on this in 2002 or 3 that I never published, and that was really dumb. It's not only in this region. I mean, clearly Poland has this already election after election. You see it increasingly in Hungary. It was very visible in Austria, the US. The problem, of course, is what is it, right? Because it's not rural-urban is many different ways. Is there many different things. The terminology is partly geographical, whereas it's not necessarily a geographical distinction. So what does it stand for? Does it stand for a different economy, for a different way of life, for different levels of multiculturalism, different levels of education? I'm not totally certain whether there is really a rural-urban that cannot be defined in other ways, as in different value structures, different economic opportunities. But it is clearly something that deserves way more attention, because we see it now in so many, and Brexit was another case. But it's also not new, right? Particularly on the EU, Norway has had it in both its referendums on EU membership, strong rural-urban cleavage. But as said, I think we need to go beyond that. We need to see what it is that creates this urban rural. And I think in part it is values, but those values are also in part related to economic opportunities. Particularly in the so-called globalized economy, the opportunities are primarily in the big cities. And so consequently, it's not that remarkable that people who live there are more in favor of globalization or European integration. We actually already know that support for European integration, for example, accession countries, was often much stronger in the West than in the East of the state, which again is not because they're necessarily so much more enlightened, as they have many more opportunities to profit from it. So I think it's a multifaceted aspect, but it's important. Trudeau is not a populist. He's very pretty. Gets a lot of media attention, part because he's very pretty. He can also do yoga in like bizarre ways. But Trudeau stands for a very old-fashioned, like 80s, 90s politics. He's a classic neoliberal, but socioculturally progressive, as Macron is, as D66 is in the Netherlands. But he refers, his discourse is all about a plural society. Society exists of different groups with different interests that come together in compromise in politics. The way that he is in the media the whole time and play, that's just what politics is these days. Politics is about personalities, and there's no reason why populist should be the only one to play the media very well. And Trudeau's a very good example, Macron's an example, and there are other examples of mainstream parties and politicians to pretty much dominate the media. The ideological renewal is complete. It's not just economic. Right? And as said, this is one of the, when you have a renewal of social democracy, right? Yes, I believe that should be based on class, international solidarity, but it should also deal with a multicultural society on which most of social democratic writers, of course, didn't have much to say. It also should speak about how can you create a social democratic policy within a European Union context, right? And so it is truly ideological. It is like a worldview speaking to all most important issues. And finally, of course, Putin, because you can't really talk about anything these days without Putin. Yes, there is a link between Putin and populists. That link is not as straightforward as is often claimed. There are broad distinctions. Some populists truly believe that Putin is the savior. Like, I mean, Salvini of the Lega Nord is truly a Putin groupie. Geert Wilders isn't. Right? Geert Wilders is anti-Ukraine, but rarely says anything positive about Putin. And then, of course, you have right-wing populists in the Baltic states and in Poland who are very much anti-Putin. But more importantly, there are a lot of mainstream politicians who are very pro-Putin. In the last presidential elections, there were 4 candidates in France. Only one was not pro-Putin and became anti-Putin because Russia intervened in the campaign, right? But it wasn't only the populist Mélenchon and Le Pen. Fillon was as pro-Putin and Russia as Le Pen, as was Sarkozy before. We have Berlusconi, we have, of course, from the inside is Orban, but we have Schröder, we have Blair, we have so many different people. Putin is first and foremost the anti-establishment actor, right? And so Putin is kind of the international stick to beat the EU with, and for the anti-American parties to beat the US with. But only a small group of populists actually consider Putin and Russia's as the model for their own politics.
Just a sentence. I think it seems that the biggest loser of the fight between populists and neoconservatives or neoliberals is social democracy. So when they lost the third way after Clinton, Schröder, Tony Blair, they are still struggling. Maybe this very day will be the game changer on this. The British elections, I don't know, but all elections show a major defeat of social democracy in France, in the Netherlands also, and other places as well. I mean, the party system, which used to be so strong, the center-right and center-left parties are now just crumbling, except Germany.
Yes, just one sentence. I would like to go back to the issue of cleavages. I think it's a very relevant relevant issue here, because I think, and I read it in several places, that maybe there is a more complex and yet to be defined cleavage emerging, and that is globalization, anti-globalization, or global-local. That is as complex as Cas just said, that it's about being an urban or rural location, ways of life, economic opportunities, and stuff. So I think it does give a background and explanation to a certain extent to populism.
Okay. Thank you. It's 1 minute after 7, so I think we are very much on time. I would like to thank you here on the podium, but also all of you for coming. It's not the end, because first we will have Peter Balázs, who will give some closing remarks, and afterwards you're invited for a small reception outside. So there you can continue in small groups or bilateral, or even have the possibility to ask questions to some of our podium guests. So Peter, you have the last words.
Thank you very much. I think it was a good talk, because after the lunch we have more appetite than before to deal more with the topic. So I think you helped us to open new questions. Populism has been successful not only in Europe, not only in the transatlantic family, but in the whole world. That's why we are speaking about it. And we would like to find out whether populism would further increase or decrease in the coming years. The first news are to some extent encouraging, because populism was defeated. You mentioned the cases, Holland, Austria. When we came to France, we have analyzed the outcome of the presidential elections, and we could state that the good news and the bad news were the same. The good news was that Macron won, and Marine Le Pen is at the second place. And the bad news was that Marine Le Pen is at the second place, and not the others. So populism is there, and populism is coming up, would like to take power, not only sitting in the back benches of the European Parliament, but to enter that magic room, which is the European Council. But only governing parties and politicians can enter this room. We'll see the German elections, what AfD will reach at the national level. There are various results in the lens of Germany. But if we take the French example, the old parties are still there. So Macron could come up in competition with the old parties. And this is the proof of his success. In Hungary, we have the old parties as well. And there are, in this choice of political offers, two parties which have not governed yet and which are eager to get closer to power. One is Jobbik, obviously. So Jobbik is motivated by taking the power. And the other was this politics can be different, LMP, which is there. The others look like descendants of former parties. But Hungary and Poland are interesting test cases, because in both governments can attend EU Council meetings, and this matters because they are disturbing decision making. They can separate a group of countries, sometimes the 4 Visegrad countries, in opposition to the majority of the EU, putting obstacles on the way of moving towards some kind of a refugee regime. Today there are elections in the United Kingdom. We haven't got any results yet, But the UK has been a very interesting other test. Already the Brexit referendum was influenced to some extent by populism as well. There were populist arguments floating around that you won't be permitted to buy eggs by dozens. You will be obliged by continental Europe to buy 10 pieces at once, and crazy things were suggested to the voters. Now, right before the elections, there was a tragic test case, this terrorist attack provoking the UK, which is a political and moral test to the elections, how it would influence the outcome of the UK elections. Today, we have heard several interesting points about populism. Let me just underline three important aspects. One is the role of the media. You suggested in the keynote speech and in the comments as well how important access to the media is. Traditional private media as well as social media and the interlinkage between the two. This is an important statement. And a second was the need of visions, of ideology to oppose populism. We should move further on that track, I think. And the third was the need of nationalism, because populism is playing on that reduced playground of states, nation states, and doesn't like the larger global or regional level like the European Union. The EU is has done a lot in order to promote historical reconciliations, friendship between nations, but there is still a lot of things to be done. Yes, Central Europe is by nature and by tradition homophobic. It was a very important statement as well. And within Hungary, I'm very curious to see how the 100 years of the Trianon Treaty will be commemorated. It's coming closer and closer. A few days ago, we had just the day, the 4th of June, of signing that treaty, but the 100 years anniversary will be a very important test. And it depends to a large extent who will set the tone and in what direction. And last but not least, in the questions, there was a very important warning signal about the social background of populism. Yes, the rural-urban division is important, but also the level of education, the age. And even before you mentioned Norway, I put it on my paper, because Norway is a very interesting test. It was another kind of Brexit, not after, but before joining the EU. And the particular interest of Norway that they repeated the referendum 2 times. Because Norway started first together with Denmark, Ireland and the UK, and the first referendum took place in 1972. And then again, together with Sweden, Finland and Austria, there was a second start and the second referendum by 1994, which is a gap of 22 years. This is 1 generation difference. And the test, the result of the test is that 2 generations voted in the same way. So that this is a deep division. Yes, Nordic fishermen voted against EU accession in Norway, and I remember the picture of Gro Harlem Brundtland, the prime minister with tears in her eyes, when she learned the news that Norway won't be an EU member. We have got a lot of new food for thought on our menu, so thank you for your interest. Thank you very much, Cas, for coming. Thank you, Christina and Adas, for the comments. Thank you, Jan, for the chair. And as you have invited the whole audience to a cup of something and a snack, let's go on with bilateral talks. The conference is closed.